All right, hey everybody, how's it going? I hope you're staying safe and healthy and doing all right. The weather's starting to get nice, but if you venture outside, please be sure to stay safe, keep distance, and if you can, wear a mask at this point, and certainly wear a mask if you're going indoors, like supermarkets and things like this. Not only to protect yourself, but to protect others, right? And in fact, actually, while we're on that topic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen while I continue to talk. But as of this weekend, right, anytime you're in a public space, per the governor's mandate, anytime that you're in a public space where it's difficult to keep the 6 feet, the social distancing, you're going to be required to wear a mask. And this is coming from the governor's office up in Albany. And so you should be aware of that, that starting this weekend, like if you're riding the bus, you're going to need a mask. If you're in the supermarket, you should be wearing a mask. And many stores, I think, are already implementing this. I know my local market already has here around the corner. But again, at this point, we're seeing a plateau, and I'm going to ask you, and we'll talk about this in a second, but we are looking at the data in New York State, New York City, for that matter. We are starting to see a plateau of cases and deaths related to coronavirus. And so, again, we're losing a lot of people. I'm sure some of you know people that we've lost, and that's a serious issue. It is the positive side of what's going on is that we are starting to see a leveling off. And so we've lost a lot of people, but the measures that we've been taking seem to be showing positive results, but we still have a ways to go. And particularly not only nationally, but particularly in New York State and in New York City. So related to the issue of the coronavirus, what we're going to do is we're going to start assignment 3. I'll get that posted and send an announcement once it's been posted. But assignment 3 will be due. This is different from the syllabus, but it's going to be due Sunday, April 26th. Okay, and I'll post a lot of announcements about this, reminders about the assignment. But essentially, you're going to be doing some policy analysis related to the coronavirus. So, and that brings us to what we're going to talk about today is problem definition and analysis. So, this is basically what I'm going to ask you to start doing is applying problem definition and problem analysis to the coronavirus issue, right? So last class or last lecture, I kind of introduced the policy analysis process, which is this kind of 5 stages of policy analysis. And the first stage there, defining and analyzing a problem, is a really important stage in policy analysis. And that's really what we're going to zero in on today. So when we talk about defining and analyzing a problem, at this stage in policy analysis, some really basic and important questions that we want to investigate and try to answer is, 1, what is the nature of the problem? And what I mean by nature of the problem is, what are the characteristics? What are the unique characteristics of this problem, right? And I mentioned in previous classes that public policy is kind of this interdisciplinary field. And so, if we're talking about water quality, we're talking about an environmental problem. And so what are the characteristics of water quality in this discussion? What is the nature of water quality problems? If we're talking about an illness, we want to talk about a public health problem, right? So we're going to think about public health aspects of a particular problem. And these are all important things to start to engage with, because it kind of narrows the scope of research or scientific data that we might start to engage with or read about in order to better understand what the characteristics or the nature of the particular problem we're investigating are. The second part or a second important question related to this that it helps when we answer the question of what is the nature, what are the characteristics, it helps us to think about what are the causes, right? This is an important step in defining a problem and starting to think about potential solutions. What's causing this thing to happen? And related to that is, what is the extent or magnitude of the problem, right? And when we talk about extent, a lot of times we're talking about the spatial extent. Is it highly localized? Is it regional? Meaning, in the US, is it covering multiple states, like the Northeast region? Is it a national problem, or is it even like a global problem, right? So the extent in a lot of cases means like the scale, the spatial scale perhaps, right? And when we talk about magnitude, a lot of times what we're thinking about is how many are impacted, right? You might have a problem that is national in scale, right? It affects people all over the country, but it might be relatively small in magnitude, right? It might not affect a large amount of people. But you might have a problem that's national in scale and affects a large population, right? And so it has higher magnitude. So a lot of times when we talk about magnitude, we talk about the amount of people impacted. Is it a particular group of people impacted? Is one group impacted more than another? These are all important things that we want to establish in defining a problem, because again, it helps us to start thinking about potential solutions to that problem. And so when we get into this, once we've established some characteristics, the causes, the extent, the magnitude, now we can start to think about goals and objectives, right? What do we want to achieve? How much do we want to reduce this problem? If we're talking about water quality, how clean does the water need to be for people to drink it, right? Are there certain levels of contamination that are acceptable for us? Are there levels that are totally unacceptable? We want to establish that. And so understanding, again, the nature of the problem, the causes of the problem, the extent, the impacts, helps us to establish goals and objectives in terms of what we want to achieve. Once we've established a goal and an objective, then we can start to think about what can we do about it. And we can start to craft potential policy solutions, right? And so each of these questions, answering each of these questions is a really critical stage in terms of defining the particular problem that we're investigating, right? So for example, we're talking about poverty in the US. Sorry, I'm just drinking some coffee. It's been a long day already. So if we're talking about poverty, we might be thinking about, of course, when we talk about poverty, oftentimes we think about poverty in terms of income, right? How much money people bring in, wages, things like this. And many people would agree, perhaps, that poverty is a problem in the US, and particularly in major metropolitan areas, New York City, many people would argue we have a poverty problem. People are not making enough income to have a certain quality of life, right? But in the abstract, poverty to you might mean something different than poverty to somebody else, right? So what is it? What are basic needs? What is a basic quality of life? What are those conditions like, right? So someone's understanding of basic needs, conditions, a certain quality of life can be unique, and that's reflected in your beliefs and values about the way the world should be, right? And so from a policy perspective, if we're talking about public policy and instituting policies to address something like poverty, we need to establish a definition for poverty, right? And so what does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to be impoverished? There's many different views on this, right? And so the federal government has to establish a clear definition, because then this determines, right, who might qualify for certain programs, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. But if we go back a year, in 2019, the Department of Health and Human Services basically established a definition of poverty that says, if you're a family of 4 living in the 48 contiguous states, which just means every state except for Alaska and Hawaii, that you're considered to be living below the poverty line if your family of 4 has an income of $25,750 or less, right? So you might look at this number and say, $25,000, if you're living in New York City with a family of 4 and you're making $25,000, you're not doing very well in terms of covering your basic needs, right? Covering rent, for example, can be very problematic if your if your income for a family of 4 is $25,000 and some change, right? Whereas if you're a family living in a place in the country where the cost of living is much lower, $25,000 for a family of 4 still might not be quite enough, right, from our view. But it will go further, right, if you're living in a place with like lower cost of living, lower rent, lower electricity costs, things like this, right? And so what I want you to be aware of is that this definition, while many people, including myself, might look at it and say this is too low, what the federal government is doing is establishing national benchmarks for poverty, right? So in that sense, they're establishing perhaps the lowest possible amount of income to consider living in poverty, because they're thinking about, if you establish the poverty line at $40,000 for a family of four, that might make more sense perhaps to someone living in New York City. But if you're, making $40,000 living in a much lower cost of living location, that might be enough to provide basic needs and have a certain level of quality of life, right? And so the federal government is establishing these national standards, whereas states might have different standards, but this is the national standard. And why is it important? Well, it's important how, in this case, the federal government defines poverty, because it determines who becomes eligible for certain benefits, right? Social welfare benefits. And so, the policy response from the federal government is to address poverty through what are called redistributive programs, where everybody kind of pays into pays a tax. A portion of this money goes into a pot that is allocated towards providing social welfare. So this is redistributive, where money comes in from everybody and only some people receive the benefits from that money. And so this is kind of the government's policy response to addressing poverty, or one way that the government seeks to address poverty is by providing social welfare programs. And so in order to determine who can receive those programs, the federal government has to provide a definition of poverty, right? It's important to note, as I kind of already mentioned, that how we understand a problem, whether or not a problem even exists, and maybe what we ought to do about that problem, is really dependent on an individual's beliefs, values, perspectives, right, about the world. So people often disagree about whether or not something is a problem that needs to be addressed, right? Some people, and again, from our perspective in this class, what we're talking about is public problems and problems that warrant government intervention, right? So some people, based on their values or policy beliefs, might not feel that poverty in the U.S. Is an issue that the government should intervene in, right? These perspectives might lean towards believing that people have the opportunity and that that they should pull up the kind of bootstrap mentality, right? So again, I'm not saying that everybody believes this, and I certainly don't. But this is just to play devil's advocate, that some people, what many people view as a problem, there's probably people out there that do not think this is a problem that warrants government intervention, right? And so it's important to understand that people have differing views about what a problem is, whether a problem exists, and therefore this leads into thinking about what should we do about it, right? So we might agree that poverty is a problem. We might be on board on the same page with believing that poverty is a problem, but we might have a different understanding about what causes poverty to exist, right? And so is it access to education, access to jobs? Is it institutional problems like institutional racism? What's causing this problem to exist? Well, depending on your view of the causes of a problem, this leads us into a potential solution, right? And so if people can agree that something is a problem, but maybe there's disagreement or differing views on the causes or the major causes of the problem, therefore we might have different views on what should be done to address it. Related to that, when we're talking about addressing a problem, what are the goals? People might have different perspectives on what the desired outcome is. If we're talking about poverty, do we want there to be absolutely zero poverty? Is there a certain level that is considered to be acceptable in the world or in the country or in the state or city that you're in, right? And so again, we have to understand and acknowledge that policy making and therefore problem definition can be highly political, right? People's values, people's beliefs about how the world should be are inserted into this process, and it leads to differences and differing views on what problems are, what potential solutions to those problems might be applied, and really what kind of outcomes we want to see occur. Um, and so one potential way to think about problem definition, given that there's different views in the world about how things ought to be and how we ought to address them, is this issue, this concept of issue framing, which we've talked about before. But issue framing is this tactic or an approach that is often used by policymakers and interest groups, where essentially these individuals, policy elites, if you will, try to set the policy agenda and frame, right? So I put a picture frame there, because what you're doing when you're issue framing is you're presenting a problem and you're framing it in a way that kind of reaches a large amount of people, right? Who might have differing beliefs, different beliefs, different values. You're trying to frame it in a way that gets people supportive of at least acknowledging that there's a problem that exists that ought to be addressed, right? And so in this sense, when we're framing an issue, each side in a debate or a discussion about an issue carefully chooses the language that they use in order to put their argument in kind of a favorable light, right? What I mean by that is if we're talking about poverty in New York City, right? Let's say, where if you live, if you live in the Bronx, I live here in the Bronx, and if we're talking about poverty, right, this is something that, and even if you don't live in the Bronx, that, in certain neighborhoods, you see it on a daily basis, you experience it, whether you're experiencing it personally or you observe it. It's something that is recognizable, and it's easy to acknowledge that it exists and that people are struggling financially, right? And so, we might be on board that poverty is a problem that needs to be addressed. Let's just say, for the sake of example, that there's people, right, living downtown in Manhattan that are fairly wealthy. Maybe they're in the 1% of national income, and they live in these high-rise apartments. And they rarely come to the outer boroughs, and they, stick to themselves in downtown. And maybe to them, right, poverty is not a key issue that they want their tax dollars going towards, right? And so the question is, how do we get people that don't necessarily experience poverty, right, whether they're personally experiencing it or they observe others experiencing it, how do we get people that aren't experiencing something and, and therefore might not feel that something is a problem? How do we get them to support a policy agenda or a campaign to address this problem of in our case, what we're talking about, poverty, right? Well, we might want to frame it in a way that makes sense to them, right? And so, if we're talking about poverty, one of the things that are key issues related to poverty is perhaps crime, right? So if people can't provide, can't receive a basic income to support their needs, we might see more instances of crime, higher instances of crime rates. And this was a problem in New York City going into like the 90s, the 80s, right? Crime was a particularly problematic, and a lot of places in Manhattan that today, don't really reflect that history. But if poverty is a problem and it drives, crime rates to be higher, and perhaps in wealthier areas, because, if people are trying to bring income through committing crimes like robberies or something, right? This might be more likely to occur perhaps in higher income areas, right? Just for example. And so if we're trying to frame this issue of poverty as a problem for somebody that doesn't really experience it, you might frame it in a way, well, there's evidence to suggest that when there's high rates of poverty, that there's high crime rates, right? One of these crimes is robbery or just, crime in general. And this is bad for your neighborhood, even though you don't live in a highly impoverished area. It creates an undesirable neighborhood and decreases the value of your property, right? Just for example. And so in this case, you're trying to frame it, right? The issue of poverty in a way that someone who doesn't really experience it and therefore might not really believe that it's a problem, you try to frame it in a way that captures their attention and gets them to acknowledge, oh, wow, I never saw this data, I never saw these statistics, I can understand how this might directly affect me, and things that I care about, perhaps, right? And therefore, you're getting people who might um, initially be on board with supporting poverty as a high political agenda item. You're seeking ways to get them to support that. And so that's kind of what issue framing is. Related to issues, if we think about things like poverty, another issue that comes up in New York City is like public transportation, right? If we're talking about something as a problem in the abstract, we really need to think about how to present information that makes sense, right? If I just tell you, wow, I walk out the door and I see poverty firsthand. That's an interesting story, right? But if you're trying to reach a broad audience, a lot of times an effective approach is to provide context, right? Rather than just abstract discussions or personal anecdotal experiences, it's important to provide some type of context. And a lot of times, how we provide context is by using what are called operational measures, right? And this is just jargon, right? So when I talk about context, I mean, what we're talking about is providing an understanding of the characteristics of the problem, the nature of the problem, its extent, its magnitude. That's what we're doing by establishing context. And when we talk about using operational measures, what we're talking about there is just using ways, oftentimes quantitative ways, to measure a problem, right? And we'll talk about some examples in a second. But for example, we want to think about how many people are affected by the issue. How has the issue changed over time? How does the issue affect perhaps different groups, different segments of the population? And therefore, policy analysts and policy makers often use operational measures or what you might call quantitative indicators to provide context, right? And what we're talking about here is just numbers, statistics, data to establish important context. How many people are affected by this? Well, 20% of the population. How has it changed over time? Well, I can show you this graph to show that rates of poverty have gone up over time. How does it affect different segments of the population? Well, it affects, people of color are more proportionally higher, are impacted by poverty at greater rates. Here's some statistics to show you that information, right? And so when we're establishing context, we want to provide operational measures, numbers to provide information. And so some key ways to do this is what, and again, if you've taken quantitative courses in the past, you may be familiar with these things, but what we're talking about here is just basic numbers. These are just some examples of how operational measures of important or basic operational measures that are used often to establish context for issues, right? So in a broader sense, we're talking here about what are called descriptive statistics, right? Statistics that can be used to describe something. So one very basic descriptive statistic is just a frequency count, right? And an example of a frequency count could be the amount of people, but from a statistical perspective, what we're talking about oftentimes is the percentage of a population that's affected by a particular issue, right? And as I already mentioned, a really basic frequency count is like the number of people who are impacted by an issue, right? And so these are called frequency counts. And again, the main objective here is just to provide context. What portion of the population, what percentage of the population is impacted by this issue? Well, here's some data to tell you. And again, if it's 1% of the population, that might be more difficult to frame as a high priority issue. If it's 50%, 1 out of 2, right, that might be much more, contextually speaking, much more dramatic to people, right? Wow, 1 out of 2 people are living in poverty. This is a really important issue that needs to be a high agenda item for policymakers to address. Other common other common descriptive statistics are things like the average value. What's the average income of people living in New York City, right? This can help establish an understanding of where income lies in general in terms of the average wage. You might often also use a median value, which just means essentially the middle of the road. So if you have like 100 people, right? Just for example, you have 100 people. What's the income? What's the middle income? If you take those 100 people and you take all of their income, which income lies in the very middle? And this tells you that half or 50 people make this amount of money and 50 people make that amount of money. And it establishes kind of a median value to help you to understand, you know, where most people lie in that continuum. Because just because you have 50 people doesn't mean the income is going to be right in the middle. It could be skewed to the left where, you know, 25% or 25 people have an income that's down much lower, whereas 75 people have an income that's much higher. And establishing these values helps us to understand, again, context, right? And this is all important in, again, defining a problem and helping people to understand the extent or magnitude of that problem. So operational measures are key, right? So if we look at some examples for the context of poverty in the US, in 2016, the US government reported that 12.7% of the population, or about 41 million Americans, were living in poverty. Right? These are just basic descriptive statistics that allow us to understand the nature of the problem. 12% is about, you know, again, 12 out of 100 people, or a little more than 1 out of 10 people are impacted by poverty, which at the national scale is a relatively large number. And if we go up to 2017, a year later, we see that it's declined a little bit, right? It went down from 12.3%, 41 million people, or excuse me, it went down from 12.7%, 41 million people, to 12.3%, 40 million people, right? So basically in that 1 year time frame, you can see a decrease in poverty of about 0.4%, or 1 million people. And again, this is just providing context on the issue of poverty. You know, people's interpretation of that context can vary, but this is the data. And this is why data is really important when we're talking about public policy and analyzing problems, is the data kind of, you know, those are actual numbers, right? And so whether or not this is good or bad, that determines or is based upon your view of the world, but this is the actual data and the numbers that are shown. But when we're talking about the use of quantitative data, we should also be aware that there are some risks, right? When we're using numbers and we're analyzing numbers or presenting numbers to set context, we need to really be critical of the numbers and the data that we're analyzing. When we get a set of data that's collected from a population, we want to vet out that data because, again, there could be issues of inaccuracy in the data itself. Maybe only certain populations are being counted. Maybe we're only collecting data from certain individuals, and certain populations are not being included that maybe should be, right? We might be using a measurement of the problem that doesn't actually capture the issue that we're trying to address. And I'll talk about an example of this in a second. But whenever we're using data, just because they're numbers and it's information, doesn't mean that there aren't caveats or risks associated with those numbers. And so we should always try to understand, right? Like, where did the data come from? Is there anything missing that should be in the data? What are the shortcomings of the data that you're providing? We want to ask these types of questions because it helps us to really understand maybe things that are being left out and not accounted for in the information that's being provided. One example of this issue of invalid measurement, just as an example, is this thing called gross domestic product, right? So if you've taken a macroeconomics class, you've probably been introduced to this term, but you might know the term just from your general understanding of macroeconomics. But gross domestic product is this number that's essentially used to measure the health of an economy, right? It's a standardized way to measure the health of an economy. And kind of the cookie cutter definition or definition of gross domestic product is it's the total amount in terms of dollar value of goods and services that are produced within an economy. right? So if you look up how is GDP or gross domestic product calculated, you'll find that, and again, this is in dollar terms, so it's in money terms, that gross domestic product is basically the sum total of investment by private entities, businesses within a national economy, within the US economy. It's the total amount of government money that's being spent or things that are being bought from the government. It's the total dollar value of those things. It's also the total value or dollar value of personal consumption. And then the total value of net trade, right? So things that are being exported to other countries brings in money, but we also import things and send money out, right? So we're determining the net of that, right? And so when we add all of these things up, this gives us GDP. And GDP is, again, as I mentioned, internationally, it's considered a standardized measure of economic development, if you will, right? So typically when we have countries that have a relatively high GDP or gross domestic product, we consider those to be what you might call developed or more developed countries. Whereas states with a relatively low GDP tend to be considered less developed or developing countries. But what's missing, right? What's missing from this operational measure is GDP, a good approach to measuring economic development? Well, many would say yes, it is, right? But we ought to acknowledge that it does have some shortcomings, right? So some shortcomings, and this is just a figure, I'm going to kind of skip over it, but this is just to show you GDP, that it's a common measure. This is pulled from The Economist. This shows the recession of the late 2000s, where GDP globally, and you have the light blue advanced economies, the dark blue developing economies. You can see over time that going into the late 2000s, the 90s into the mid 2000s, that GDP across the globe, for the most part, with the exception of 1998, was seeing positive increases every year. Everybody's economies, national economies, were growing globally, even less developed places, more developed countries. Everybody's GDP was growing. Then in 2009, beginning in 2008, going into 2009, you see a big negative number there, a negative decline in gross domestic product, which means economies were shrinking, right? And this is not good for an economy to experience. And so, again, GDP is just used as a standardized measure of economic well-being or economic health for a nation, right? But there are some shortcomings that have been identified in this standardized measure of economic development, right? What is not being accounted for in this measurement? There's a number of things, and we'll talk about a couple. But one is that this measurement of GDP, using the market economy, things like domestic business expenditures, government expenditures, net trade, personal consumption, all of these measurements are based on dollar values, money that's being transferred, right? Therefore, GDP does not account for what we might call non-market transactions, right? These are things that have value, right? They arguably have value to an economy, but they don't have dollar values. What we're talking about here is basically unpaid labor and or services, right? Things that people do for others that provide benefit, but they don't get money in exchange, right? So doing volunteer work, right? If you're doing volunteer work, let's say you're volunteering to help feed the elderly or feed the homeless, right? This arguably has some type of value to the economy, and it provides a valuable service, but because there's no money transfer, it's not being accounted for in gross domestic product measurements, right? So that's one criticism, is that these types of things are not being included in measurements of GDP. There's this other criticism in the environmental policy world that has been brought up with GDP, is that that the environment provides a lot of valuable services to society, right? And oftentimes we think of these things in the context of what are called ecosystem services, right? One example of this is like when you have trees, for example, right? Trees can help support photosynthesis. They can help put oxygen into the air. Trees also provide shade and perhaps a desirable quality of life. they also take in carbon dioxide, right? And all of these things are natural processes that are services from an ecosystem perspective that benefits society. They have benefit to human populations and therefore the economy, right? But these things also, they don't have dollar value. And if we're talking about trees, right, the fact is that these ecosystem services arguably provide value to society and the economy. They're not being accounted for. But what does get accounted for is if we were to cut down these trees, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do this, but again, I'm just saying that this is an argument, is that when we cut down trees and sell them, right, as lumber, that this brings value into the economy. But that value is not accounting for the lost value of those ecosystem services. And so again, some people have argued that this is kind of a shortcoming of using gross domestic product as an operational measurement of economic growth or well-being, right? And so again, whenever we're working with operational measures, quantitative data, we should always be critical of the data we're looking at and really think critically about what is, and more importantly, perhaps even what is not being accounted for in that data. So another challenge when we're talking about operational measures is anticipating the future, right? And with assignment 3, I'm going to ask you to dive into this a little bit in the context of the coronavirus. But one of the most important questions with the current pandemic is like, how many people can we expect to see hospitalized? How many people are we expecting to see, lose their lives to the coronavirus? And this, determining these things is challenging, right? And it requires researchers to establish forecasts, or what you might call projections, right? And what we're doing when we do forecasting or projecting is researchers look at current and past conditions, right? Current and past hospitalizations and deaths related to the coronavirus. They also look at things like policies, right? Shelter-in-place orders, testing, hospital beds, and they look at all these different factors related to current and past conditions, and they try to understand, if things stay the way that they are now, what will the future look like? If we implement even more strict policies, how will that affect projections of hospitalizations and deaths, right? So you're relying on things that are called models, right? And these models are generally statistical in nature. They provide you, projections with levels of uncertainty, right? So the figure I put here is just in the climate change world, we're often interested in understanding what temperature changes we can expect to see in the future given emissions of greenhouse gases, right? And greenhouse gases are these things that contribute, they basically they basically act as kind of a blanket in the atmosphere. So they basically kind of put a blanket around the earth. And so when you have heat from the sun coming in, and some of that heat, generally speaking, bounces off the earth or is reflected back off the earth and would go back into space. But if you have more and more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that heat coming in that is then reflected can get trapped by these greenhouse gases and cause this warming to occur, right? And so in the climate change policy discussion, what we're often thinking about is projections about temperature changes given what we anticipate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, right? And so greenhouse gas emissions, what we call scenarios, these projections, right? What you see there are 3 different scenarios. A low emission scenario in the blue, a high emission scenario in the red, and an even higher emission scenario in the purple or magenta, whatever that is. And then if you look at the black line there, that is actual observed temperature going from like the late 2000s all the way back to the beginning of the 1900s. That's observed data, that's actual data. And we use the actual data. We also think about, again, how do we come up with these scenarios? Well, we think about policies that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So let's say we have some policies to reduce the use of fossil fuels. Well, that's what we use to project kind of like the low emission scenario, right? But let's say we think fossil fuels might become cheaper and therefore we burn more of them, and we don't have policies to reduce the fossil fuel use, then we might see even more greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, or population growth is occurring and we're still burning fossil fuels. And so this might produce that higher emissions scenario. In each scenario, you're making assumptions, right, about the future. And so it's really important to understand that when we're looking at projections, they're predictions. And these predictions are based on assumptions about what will occur in the future. And it's a really a difficult thing to do in some cases, right? So when we make these projections, circumstances can change. And I'm going to ask you to look at some of the projections related to the coronavirus, but in a lot of ways, New York has stayed beneath the projected rates of hospitalizations that were predicted by a number of different models, right? And so whenever we see models, and each of those models made assumptions about the world, and it's not to say, and I think I showed a slide with this in previous lecture when we still had in-person meetings. It's not to say that models aren't important, right? All models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So it gives us an understanding, basic understanding of what we might expect the future to look like. But it's important that we just don't take a model or a projected outcome and take it to the bank, right? Like this is what's going to happen. We should always look at the assumptions that are made by the model, and we should always understand that circumstances can change. So when we look at 1 year where we saw a big decline because of a certain policy regarding greenhouse gas emissions, that those policies can change. The cost of fossil fuels can change, right? So if fossil fuels all of a sudden become much more expensive, we're likely to see a decline in emissions regardless of policy adoption efforts, right? And so it's really important to take account of these factors and understand that models make projections. There is uncertainty in models, but they do provide kind of a baseline understanding of the world, as long as we recognize that there are assumptions being made and we acknowledge those assumptions, right? The last thing I want to talk about in today's lecture is this issue of thinking about causes, right? When we talk about causes, there's kind of two primary types of causes that I want you to be aware of. And in the policy world, we talk about proximate causes and root causes, right? Most policy studies tend to focus on what is often referred to as the proximate or immediate cause of public problems. An easy way to think about a proximate cause is just like the direct cause. So, for example, if we're talking about global climate change, all right, fossil fuels are the burning of fossil fuels like gas, oil, coal. This is one of the primary drivers of global climate change, right? So if we talk about causes, the proximate cause of climate change is the combustion of fossil fuels, right? And so, most policy efforts focus on reducing fossil fuel combustion, right? These are things, which is, again, the direct cause. The greater challenge in a lot of different policy discussions is to address the root cause or the underlying cause of the problem, right? So the underlying cause of climate change, of course, is the fact that we are so reliant on fossil fuels, right? And that reliance leads to burning. And so the direct cause of climate change is the combustion of fossil fuels, but arguably the root cause of climate change is that we have an economy that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, all right? And so why do policymakers or policy studies often focus on this kind of proximate or direct cause rather than the underlying cause? Well, there's a lot of political reasons, right? So let's say you're an elected official, you have a finite window of time to accomplish your policy goals, right? You run on a campaign, let's say, to address climate change. Now, you get elected into office, and the people that elected you want to see you take action on climate change. Are you going to address the proximate or direct causes, or are you going to focus on addressing the root causes, right? And maybe you choose to focus on both, but many policymakers choose to focus on the direct cause because you're more likely to see the most immediate change from focusing on those things, right? And so, you know, again, implementing policies like a tax on fossil fuel consumption, a tax on gasoline, these types of policies will have an impact on the direct or proximate cause of climate change, the consumption of fossil fuels, right? And, you know, in general, if we're able to enact a policy that addresses the direct causes, you're likely to see changes occur relatively quickly, right? And so from a policymaking perspective, if you're elected for a 4-year term, or let's say you're in the House of Representatives and you're elected for a 2-year term, right? You're making decisions in this small window of time so that you can get something done so that when you come up for re-election, you can show that you're making positive change in the areas you said you would, right? And so this is one of the main reasons why a lot of times policymakers tend to focus on proximate or direct causes of a problem rather than really addressing the underlying or the root problem, right? If we want to address the root problem of climate change, this is going to require a transition to, you know, renewable sources of energy that do not rely on the combustion of fossil fuels. This is not going to happen in a 2, 4, or a 6-year time frame. It's going to happen over a much longer time period. And so if you're just working on that, it's not going to happen, you know, overnight. And so when you come up for re-election, people might ask, well, what have you been doing? And maybe you've been doing a lot, but there's no real visible, perhaps, indicator that things are changing. And so this is one of the reasons why policymakers oftentimes focus on proximate or immediate causes of a problem rather than addressing the root or underlying causes, right? And so again, it's important to note that in public policy, most problems have multiple causes. And so, you know, various issues have multiple causes. And so it's important to acknowledge that when we establish a cause, a lot of times a policymaker might choose to focus on one, whereas another policymaker might choose to focus on another. And so, you know, this again is a situation where values, beliefs about the nature of the world and the way things should be can essentially enter the conversation of what is the cause, therefore how should we address it? What is the cause of the problem? If there's disagreement about the cause, there's going to be disagreement about the solutions, right? So at the end of the day, basically, in terms of problem definition and analysis, problem definition and problem analysis more generally, analysis can begin with making an explicit list of goals and objectives about what of different actors and really what we can do to reach them, right? So I talked in the beginning of this lecture about issue framing. Once we understand the causes of a problem, the nature of the problem, the magnitude, the extent, we can think about who's involved in this discussion, right? Who's involved in this particular realm of public policy, and begin to think about reaching out to those individuals. And then we can start crafting or thinking about potential solutions to these problems and identifying opportunities for intervention to address them, right? So again, we need to think about causes, and that's the last thing that I want to talk about. I'm kind of reaching the end of my rope. But we'll come back to this slide at the beginning of next lecture. But at this point, you should have a good starting point for understanding kind of what I want you to do with assignment 3. Again, you should be reading this section of chapter 4, problem and definition analysis, and I'm going to provide you direction in assignment 3 on how to do this. But I'm asking you to do very simple and basic problem analysis around the coronavirus issue. All right. So please stay safe. We'll talk to you soon. And I'll be saying a bunch of announcements about work coming your way. All right.